Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm excited to be here today with Todd Cherches, who is the author of Visual Leadership. He's also given a TED Talk on the topic. Todd, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks so much. Great being with you.
So talk to me, how do you define the term visual leadership?
Yeah, visual leadership is the application of visual thinking to the practice of leadership. And visual thinking is basically about thinking in pictures. So often in the business world, we think in terms of words and numbers, like try to get people to focus on the visual side of things and to see things through a different lens.
Beautiful. Give me a couple examples of that. And this is, people are going to have to imagine this, listeners, of course, because we are on the audio. But so paint a picture for our minds.
I love that. Yeah, definitely. Yes, sometimes we take visual information in through our eyes, but we could also take it in through our ears, as we're doing right now with an audio podcast. So we could use visual thinking in terms of using imagery, but also using visual language. So when we tell stories, we're painting a picture with words. We're almost creating a mental movie in the mind of someone else. And when we use metaphors and analogies, we're helping people to see things in a different perspective by comparing something they're familiar with to something that they may be unfamiliar with. So if you're a salesperson and you say, this is kind of like that, you're using an analogy. Or if you're saying, if you could use a baseball analogy, or you could use a nature analogy, which might be more universal to someone who maybe doesn't know anything about baseball. So you could use words like, well, I'm going to plant the seed for this idea. We're going to branch out in new directions. We're going to get to the root of the problem. We're going to see which ideas bear fruit. And the sky's the limit. So I just used like 5 different visual metaphors, all relating to nature, but the other person will know what we're talking about, and it very often creates a picture in the person's mind. If you talk about branching out in new directions, you can almost picture a mind map and writing it down and say, all right, we're in this business, but what other areas can we branch out into, right? So we use metaphors so often that we don't even realize it, but with visual thinking and visual leadership, we could be more aware and more strategic and intentional in how we use visuals to support our communications.
Okay, so using kind of metaphors would be one example of visual leadership. What are some other examples? I'm imagining that one might be when you're problem solving with your team or on the whiteboard with your team, trying to put something into some sort of schematic or drawing a picture, even if your drawing skills aren't Pablo Picasso quality, just trying to use stick figures and so forth. But talk to me about, beyond just metaphors, what would some other applications be of visual leadership?
Sure. Well, you just use the word imagine. And if you think about the word imagine, the root word is image, right? So it's about, we're using visual language even when we don't realize it. So yeah, I break it down into 4 categories. The 4 categories are, category 1 is the use of visual imagery. So that could be pictures, that could be PowerPoint slides, that could be props. It could be any picture or visual image, including drawing. So just as you were talking about, even if you suffer from ICD, which is I can't draw syndrome, if you could draw a stick figure, if you could draw a line, a circle, a square, or a triangle, if you could play Pictionary with your friends, you're qualified to get up on a whiteboard or a flip chart and sketch something out. So I always say that you don't need to be a graphic recorder, you don't have to be an artist in order to represent something visually. It's just about getting out of your head and onto some medium like paper or a whiteboard so that other people can see what you're saying. So that's category 1, using visual imagery, pictures. Category 2 is using mental models and frameworks. And this could be a company's organizational chart. It could be a map. It could be a process diagram. It could be Post-it notes that you rearrange on a wall. So we could use all these different techniques, again, to represent ideas in a visual way. And then category 3 is using metaphor and analogy we were just talking about, and then storytelling with bonus points for humor if and when appropriate. And I always talk about, when people ask why visuals, I talk about this in my TED Talk on the power of visual thinking. I break it down to 3 categories: attention, and they rhyme: attention, comprehension, and retention. When you use visual imagery or visual language, it captures people's attention and gets them to focus. It helps to create understanding because people say, okay, now I get what you're saying. And it helps people to remember because as humans, we are just wired visually. So there's more science behind it, but those are the key words to keep in mind. How am I going to get someone to focus, get them to understand, and get them to remember my message.
So let's make it a practical example. Let's say you have a head of a business unit, and they can you decide what the business unit sells. They can sell software to fast food restaurants, or they can sell used tires, or they can sell what you pick what they sell. And
Uh-huh.
this general manager has read your book, and they're trying to problem solve with their team of how do we drive growth in
Hmm.
2023. So what would some ways that they could incorporate, and they're at the whiteboard, right? So they got the
Hmm.
team together, whoever you want at the table, head of product, the head of sales, head of operations. They're trying to problem solve. Okay, how do we drive growth?
Sure.
What would
Yeah, let
a
me give you this example. I was just teaching in my NYU leadership class. I teach leadership in the HR master's program at NYU, and I teach leadership for Broadway stage managers in the MFA theater program at Columbia. So in my NYU class the other night, I used the example. Let's say you were selling consulting services, and you were meeting with someone who runs a medical office or a healthcare company, right? You may use their language, and you can say something like, "We are going to help you diagnose the problems and help you to prescribe solutions that will cure some of the ills that ail your business," right? Just using that example, you're using medical terminology that they will understand. And when you're speaking this way, the other person's thinking, "Oh, this person gets us. They're speaking our language." So that's just one extreme example. But if you're using the terminology and language of your audience or your listener, you're going to meet them not where you live, but where they live. So it's kind of it's not manipulative. It needs to be done in a very genuine, sincere way. But like if I'm talking to someone who's here in New York, I use a baseball analogy and I talk about the Yankees, it's going to resonate with them. But if I'm meeting with a client in Boston, I'm not going to give a Yankees analogy. I may use a Boston Red Sox example, or I may talk to someone in Europe and I'll use a soccer football analogy, right? So you again want to speak the language of your stakeholders, being aware of their all the variables, right? In spirit of diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging, you want to consider all of the, who is this person I'm talking to and what's going to resonate with them. And one real life example, I wrote an article for Inc. magazine called "Can You Draw What Your Company Does?" And I do this exercise with my clients where they have to get up on a whiteboard and visually illustrate, even if they can't draw that well, they have to draw a picture of how would you explain to someone what your company does and how it's different from the competition. And this was a pharmaceutical sales team, and this guy drew a picture of a whale eating up these goldfish. And he said, "We're going to eat up our competition." And the VP of the department said, "I love the analogy in a way, but it's not 100% accurate because it's not like we're whales and our competition are goldfish, because some of them are even bigger than us." And he thought about it for a second. He said, "It's more like we're dolphin and they're sharks, because they just want to bite off the business and swim away, leaving their clients bleeding. We're more like dolphins because we are warm and friendly and cuddly, and we communicate well, and we're empathetic." So that whale versus goldfish analogy turned into a dolphin versus shark analogy, and the dolphin became their mascot. The dolphin became a metaphor that represents who we are and how we're going to live our core values to take care of our customers. So that's one example of how by changing the picture, we can change the reality and our behavior and how we're going to interact with our customers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. That's kind of a very kind of metaphorical illustration
Mm-hmm.
of kind of the business situation. I can imagine, business professionals and leaders also being a little bit more literal minded as well if asked
Mm-hmm.
to do
Yeah,
that. Like, okay, we have drawing the manufacturing plant. We have this manufacturing plant, and then drawing some like cars, and these are our salespeople going to visit the clients.
exactly.
And
Exactly.
these are our three segments. We have small mom and pop businesses. We have big Fortune 500, and then we have e-commerce or something, and like little icons for those different things to make it present.
Exactly. Yeah, I was working with a group of CEOs who had known each other for years, and one guy mapped out his entire supply chain from beginning to end, where he gets his materials, from where they're constructed to end user. And the guy sitting next to him, he said to him, "I've known you for 15 years, and I kind of knew what you did, but until you drew it out for me, I didn't really understand the steps in the process. And, to me, it went from A to B, but you drew it from A to Z. You mapped out like every step. So now I could see when you're talking about these are some of the roadblocks. I was talking about R&R, resources and roadblocks. And he used that language to say, now I could see why certain resources you're lacking are causing a problem. And now I can see some of the roadblocks that are standing in your way. And roadblock is a metaphor, by the way. But again, he mapped out with Post-its and connecting lines, the process from start to finish. So that's a great example of how you can, by drawing it and illustrating the pieces of the puzzle, and you could do a process map, you could do a mind map, you could do a storyboard. There's all kinds of ways of doing it. You could draw a four-box matrix, right? And say, like a SWOT analysis is a good example of using visual imagery. It could be a pyramid, it could be a ladder, but you're basically trying to come up with some way. We always talk about thinking outside the box, but you can't think outside the box until you think inside the box and think about how are we going to frame or structure what we do, how we do it, and all the pieces of the puzzle, to use another metaphor. And then we could say, what pieces are we missing? Or maybe we want to change the puzzle box altogether. So those are just some real practical ways. So right, it could be metaphorical, and it could be fun and creative, or it could be something as linear as let's just map out the steps of our process and see if we're missing something or if we could do something better, faster, or cheaper.
I love the example or sort of the exercise of, draw what your business does.
Mm-hmm.
What are some other exercises that you incorporate in your teaching when you're attempting to teach visual leadership?
Yeah, I did this with my class a couple of weeks ago, and I actually did a workshop on visual leadership as a webinar. I said, draw a leader. You have 2 minutes, draw a picture of a leader. What does a leader look like to you? And what ended up happening is most people drew a middle-aged white male in a business suit that kind of looked, it was their interpretation of like Don Draper from Mad Men, right? They would draw a leader who had big ears, not literally, but represented listening, or a big watch that represented time management, or the leader would be taller than his followers, and I'm saying his for a reason. If 80% of the people draw a middle-aged white male when they think of leadership, what's the impact of that in terms of diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity when you're hiring, when you're promoting, in terms of who gets listened to, right? I always talk about 3 V's: visibility, voice, and value. You want to be seen, you want to be heard, and you want to be making a contribution. But if your image of a leader is a middle-aged white male, then who are you passing over for promotion? Who are you not listening to? Who are you not giving a chance to? And what's interesting is when female executives do this, they kick themselves afterwards because there's so few of them have said, here I am talking about women empowerment and developing, females in leadership, and yet I had 2 minutes to draw a leader, and look what I drew, a middle-aged white male. So in order to change the reality, we need to change the picture in our mind of what leadership looks like. So that's another example of how I use drawing to hammer home a point of how the picture in our head influences not only what we see, but what we don't see.
What would some other exercises be if someone at home here wants to try some of these things? So one might be, okay, we're kind of giving away the secret on this one a little bit, but drawing a leader, but drawing what your own business does. What are some other exercises that you encourage people to try?
Well, among many, one is, there's all kinds of models out there, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or sometimes, or Simon Sinek's golden circle, right? Start with why, and it goes what, why, what, and how. So what I sometimes have people do is take a model that exists that you're familiar with, and if you had to fix it, change it, or improve it, what would you add? What's missing? What's your interpretation? So I have people take an existing model, like, is Maslow still current and is it still relevant, or might you add something to it, right? Or create your own model. So that's something I do too. There's the same regarding models that George Box, ironically his name is Box, a British statistician, said that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So that reminds us that models are not reality. They are a visual representation of reality, and it may help us solve a problem or see something more clearly, but there's always flaws in it. So that's an exercise I would do with people, is have them, can you map out your business? What would be, here's an example. Every story has who, what, when, where, why, and how. So I'll have people say, all right, who's involved in your business? What business are you in? What do you produce? What products or services are you selling? where and when. Where's your market? When do you do this? Is it seasonal, time of day, etc.? When do you do your best business? The why is, think about the why behind all your answers to all of these questions. Like, what are the reasons? And then the how is like, how can we do something differently or better based on this analysis? So these are just a few frameworks, or have people make a list. My ABC decision-making tool is, let's say you have three options to choose from, three vendors or three bottles of wine or three pieces of technology. List them out, describe them, list the pros and cons of each one, pick which one is the best solution, explain your rationale, and then show it to someone else and see what they come up with. Say, based on what don't reveal your answer or your choice yet, but let someone do their own ABC analysis, and then you could say, all right, I agree with this, or I don't, but here's why. But if you take that to your boss, or if you take that to a client, you can help them walk through a problem-solving process in a visual way, in a structured, linear kind of way, but you've, quote, done your homework. You know how in math class you might have gotten the right answer, but the teacher wanted you to show your work. You want to see how you got to that solution, because maybe there's a better solution, or maybe there's something that you missed. So again, when you get it out of your head and onto a piece of paper into any format, then you're able to see it and step back from it and see the big picture, and then see, sometimes we need a microscope, sometimes we need a telescope, and sometimes we need a kaleidoscope. So that's a visual metaphor, right? So sometimes we want to get down into the details, sometimes we want to look long and out into the future, and sometimes we want to look through that kaleidoscope and in the spirit of innovation and creativity, and see what else is possible.
Now, we haven't talked so far about visual management in terms of, which can have a few different meanings. One could be looking at metrics and making them visible in the workplace. So you might have a call center with some real-time numbers flashing on a screen of what's the current wait time, how many people on hold, some kind of numbers like that.
Yeah, like a dashboard.
Like a dashboard, but it could be real time, for everyone to see on a big monitor. Or in a factory where you might walk around and have green lights indicating if a given production line is running smoothly, or red lights if it's stopped, or yellow lights if it's running slow, or some sort of Kanban management system for this needs to be refilled, et cetera. So some visual cues in the workplace. And I've seen some of that as well in more white-collar environments where you might have in a sales floor a kind of a thermometer of how we're doing on sales for the month. Talk to me a bit about kind of visual cues in the workplace, your thinking around that. So this is not the problem-solving piece up front, but this is managing the business on a day-to-day basis and giving people a sense of, how are we doing right now?
Yeah, I love that, the example you just gave, using red light, yellow light, green light, because culturally it's familiar, right? That's a traffic signal. We all have seen it. We know what it means. So one of the exercises I do with my coaching clients is what I call stop, start, continue. It's basically, what are the behaviors that either you or the team or the organization needs? What yellow light, what's working? What should we continue doing? So yellow is keep going. Red light, is there anything that we're doing that is unproductive or counterproductive that we need to stop doing? And green light, is there anything that we need to either start doing in place of that, or just start doing in general, something that's been on our list that we haven't gotten to yet? So just using stop, start, continue. I usually add the magic wand to that. If we can wave a magic wand and magically change one thing about our business overnight, what would it be? Unfortunately, there is no magic wand, but in lieu of that, what could we do instead? What are some steps that we could take in that direction? But just framing something and using that red light, yellow light, green light, you're taking a cultural, color-coded construct that we're familiar with, but you're applying it, again, to an assembly line or to a white-collar type of job where you could think through problems in that way. And when you use visuals and when you use color coding, it's kind of a shorthand, right? You just see it, and then you can use red, yellow, green markers to mark things off and say, let's group things together. So that's one of the chapters of my book is called Stop, Start, Continue, and the Magic Wand. So again, there's a lot of examples in my book of models, metaphors, and stories that we could use to solve these business problems that like, for example, head, heart, hands, and feet, right? Head is like, logically, what's my brain telling me? Heart, what is my heart telling me in terms of passion? You can even add gut, what's my gut telling me? Hands is about joining hands in cooperation and teamwork, and feet is about taking the first step and getting moving, right? So just if you get your picture a stick figure with a big head and then a body, head, heart, hands, and feet is to make sure that you're taking a holistic view of a situation, not just focusing on, the numbers may say one thing, but your heart and your gut may be telling you something else. So you need to pay attention to that. If you're just going based on the numbers, one of the things I talk about in the book is numbers are meaningless outside of their context and outside of the story they're telling, right? So often we may bore people to death with statistics and data as opposed to using a graph or a visual or a chart or, that will explain what the numbers mean and then what's the story it's telling us. And then the so what is what do we do with this information, right? So that's a big thing. A lot of times presenters and or, salespeople, bore people to death with numbers instead of talking about what do these numbers actually mean and how can they help us.
Todd, tell us a bit about your portfolio of activities. So you already mentioned that you are teaching at a couple universities and you are doing some coaching. Like, just give us an overview of your range of activities.
Sure. Well, my company is called Big Blue Gumball, and it's a metaphor that represents the world, the earth, or the globe. It's like a big blue gumball, however you want to take it. And we do management training, leadership development, team building, and executive coaching. So we only do anything related to people skills and people, the human side of business. So we don't get into finance or strategy or sales and negotiation. We focus solely on the human elements of how do you communicate better, how do you motivate people, how do you manage and lead more effectively. So that's my company. And I work with clients from startups to large companies. As long as I'm working with their people to help them improve, that's what my focus is on. My teaching side of things, I teach leadership at NYU and at Columbia in 2 different graduate programs. So I teach people how to use my visual leadership processes to manage and lead more effectively. I'm a member of Marshall Goldsmith's MG 100 Coaches, which is a community of some of the top coaches in the world. And for those who don't know Marshall Goldsmith, he is the #1 executive coach in the world, and he's the author of my favorite leadership book, or I should say my second favorite since I wrote mine, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, the 20 workplace habits you need to break. So if you haven't read that, it's definitely a must read for any business person, because a lot of times, as Marshall says, we're successful not always because of how we are, but in spite of how we are. So we may be doing these 20 fatal flaws that if we got rid of some of them, we'd be even more effective and more successful. So that's what I do. So it's management leadership training and executive coaching. It's teaching at 2 universities and guest lecturing at others. I speak on a lot of panels, do a lot of podcast interviews. And I just wrote my first article for the New York Times that got published a couple of weeks ago on how I use the New York Times in my class. And I've also written a few articles for Inc. magazine.
That's amazing. And for the management training that your firm delivers to everything from startups to big corporations, do you have sort of employees or set of subcontractors or other coaches that you'll pull in and work with you on those, or those primarily led by yourself? Or
Yes, primarily myself. I do have a business partner for projects that require more than one person, and then I have associates who I bring in if we need more than that. But usually what people are buying is me and my methodologies and my visual leadership type of approach. So it's traditional management training and leadership development only, that you would get from Harvard Business School or elsewhere, but with this visual approach as the lens through which we see everything. So it's a new, fresh way of incorporating visuals into what we do. But yeah, my company works with large and small offsites, remote training, etc. So
how did you get onto this idea of focusing on the visual aspects of leadership? What was the origin of that?
Yeah, so my origin story, I touched on it a little bit in my TED Talk on the power of visual thinking. Basically, I was an English literature major as an undergrad, so I was big on, my concentration was in Shakespeare and poetry. So I was already oriented towards storytelling and the use of character and metaphor and the fact that stories have beginnings, middles, and ends, and we are all the hero of our own life story. So that was ingrained in me from a very young age. And I grew up watching Superman and Batman. So I always loved the superhero thing. So in a way, becoming an executive coach was being, in some ways, instead like Superman, instead of having X-ray vision, I have visual thinking as my superpower. And like Batman, I don't have a bat utility belt, but I do have my coaching utility belt of tools, tips, and techniques. So in a way, I am making the world better and saving people through visual leadership. So, but my background is in in English literature, and then I worked in the entertainment industry for the first 10 years of my career. I worked in advertising here in New York, and I moved out to LA, and I worked for a number of entertainment companies, including Disney and CBS, developing TV shows. Then I became a project manager in the theme park business, and I managed a number of projects, including one in China. And when I was in China, I got there and no one spoke any English, and we were installing these robotic animal figures for a cultural theme park. And I realized if I couldn't communicate with words, maybe I could communicate with pictures. So I started sketching out, like, we need a hammer, or we need 10 nails, or we need whatever. And I started through point pictures and pointing, I was able to communicate non-verbally to people who didn't speak English, and we were able to get this done. And that was like kind of my origin story, my light bulb moment of, hey, if you could use visual imagery to communicate, it's more effective than just words alone. And I later found out that's a scientific principle called the picture superiority effect and dual coding theory, that when you use words and pictures in combination, it's more effective than either on their own. So I didn't, even though I did this intuitively, I didn't realize it was a thing until many years later. But that's the origin of how I got into using visuals coming out of the entertainment and media industry and applying what I did there to the practice of executive coaching and leadership development and management training. So that's the origin story of how my worlds collided, and now it's the focus and center of everything that I do.
Talk to me a bit about your work with in the stage with Broadway and stage professionals. How does your training apply there? And tell me about some of your work in that space.
Sure. In the Master of Fine Arts Theater program at Columbia, there are people who are getting their degrees, their master's degrees in stage management, which is basically the people who control the show. They control the lights and all the electronics and all that kind of stuff. And being here in New York, many of the students who go through this program also work on Broadway shows. So they will do an internship at a play during the day or during the evening, and then they're getting their degree in this. So as a stage manager, you need to get things done through and with other people. So it's not just the technology side of things and the mechanical and the equipment side of things. You need the people skills. You need to work with directors and other crew and staff and administrators and directors and producers and all kinds of egos. And it's not enough to just have the functional and technical skills. You need the people skills. So that's what people are learning from me, is how to communicate more effectively, how to influence, how to manage and lead, even without authority. Even if you don't have people reporting to you, you still need to get things done through and with other people. And when I train them in these visual techniques, they're able to use visual language and visual imagery to communicate more effectively, to get people on their side and to influence. So that's the connection there.
Fantastic. Well, Todd, I want to thank you for being on the show. I want to provide listeners with ways to find out more about you. So we will include in the show notes a link to your TED Talk and to your book. And what other links should we provide, or ways for people to follow up and find out what you have going on?
Sure. The best way, I have two websites. One is my name, toddcherches.com. That focuses on my public speaking and my book. My company, Big Blue Gumball, I have that website, bigbluegumball.com. Also, feel free to link in with me. I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, so just say you heard me on Will's show and you want to connect with me. I'm happy to link in because I always post things on what I'm doing on visual leadership, etc. And yeah, my book, Visual Leadership, is available on Amazon.
Fantastic. Todd, thank you for joining today.
My pleasure, Will. Thank you for having me.